Hello and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt. Throughout history, religious traditions across the globe have helped adherents deal with death through rituals, beliefs, and symbols. Here to discuss the role of religion in confronting death is Dr. Gong Mai of our very own Philosophy and Religion Department. Welcome, Dr. Mai. I thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it. Now, you have been with us for some time and you're teaching this fascinating course called Confronting Death to undergraduates. And I've always been interested to know, I mean, here are these students who are in the flush of life, they think they're invincible, and yet they're coming in droves to take this course about death. What's going on there? Do you have any ideas?
No, I don't know why they're taking it, but I do think that it's a universal kind of problem, death is. So maybe at a certain age, when they're leaving home and they're trying to find their identity, death arises, mortality arises as a kind of impetus to think about identity, possibly.
I see. And you in particular deal with death in the context of religion, religious practice and ritual.
Right, right. So the course is divided into 3 parts. The first part we look at the history of Buddhism and its approach to death. The second part is the history of Christianity and its approach to death. And the last part is non-religious secular approaches to death in American culture as influenced by the medical industry and the funeral industry and popular culture.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that one of the primary functions of religion is to help adherents confront death, deal with death, either their own or the death of loved ones?
I think it's an important function. I don't know if it's a primary function.
Okay.
I don't think I'm ready to say that.
Okay.
Because religion has so many other functions as well. But just because I focus on death, I tend to think it is a primary function, but then I stop and think, just because I'm interested in it doesn't mean it's the most important function.
But it certainly is one of the important functions.
Yes, yes.
And it seems to be universal to religions across time and across place. I'm wondering if there are any kind of commonalities. I know you do a kind of comparative study.
Yeah.
Are there any commonalities or universal traits about how religion tends to deal with death?
I think, to me, what's most interesting is there are generally 2 approaches, even though I know that it's really dangerous to say that there's generally 2 approaches. But there's 2 approaches. One approach is to kind of manage death. And this we see in indigenous traditions, in non-soteriological, non-universal religions. And so in this type of approach, death is something that happens to you in terms of mortality, and death is something that happens to others. So you have to deal with mortality and grief. And the general approach to this approach is to manage death in terms of rituals of purity and pollution, to put the dead in their proper place in relationship to the living.
Right.
With the rise of soteriological universal religions, what you have is this possibility of transcending death itself, the possibility of immortality, or in Buddhism, the possibility of escaping samsara, the cycle of rebirth and redying. So
that gives the second type of religion here, the second way of dealing with death, gives rise to theories about the afterlife, for example, and we might want to talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, yeah.
Am I correct? I seem to remember from a long time ago when I was taking anthropology that some of the earliest rituals that we might consider religious had to do with death rituals. Is that accurate?
I don't know. I'm not an anthropologist, and I think it's generally accurate to the extent where we're able to extrapolate from bare bones data.
Right.
So there's so much we can say, but to what degree of certainty, I really don't know. But it seems to be the case that this is a deliberate burial with objects in the particular posture or fashion. So it seems to be a concern with the disposal of the dead minimally. Whether or not it means a kind of search for an afterlife, that I think is more than we have the ability to say.
Okay.
Because I mean, what is the afterlife?
Right, we might be reading into it from our own perspectives. Okay, well, I want to get back to some of the particular rituals that you talk about in your class, but we had a very kind of interesting exercise this week. One of our producers went out on the quad and talk to students about what they think about death. So we have a little 2-minute video clip here. I thought we would watch it, and then maybe you can respond to it briefly. Sure.
Great.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Katerina Bernardi, and I'm an associate producer here at Religion and Life on App TV. On this week's episode of Religion and Life, we'll be discussing death and how religion helps individuals cope with loss. We interviewed App State students to get their take on the matter. So do you consider yourself to be a religious person?
Yeah, I would.
What religion do you affiliate with?
I'm a Christian or Methodist, I guess.
I'm not super religious. I grew up Catholic, but I don't consider myself very religious.
Yes, I'm a Christian.
And so you believe in the concept of an afterlife?
Yes, I believe that if you believe in God and, like I said, believe that Jesus is your Savior, that when you die, that you go to heaven.
And do you believe in an afterlife?
Yeah, I believe there's one.
Does the concept of an afterlife help you deal with grief or loss at all?
I think it makes it easier to understand kind of what death is. It's if it doesn't all just end, if there's something more to it.
Personally, I don't think so, but I do think that other people find that the concept of an afterlife does help people grieve, and it kind of gives you a peace of mind. Yeah, I think it gives a peace of mind.
I definitely believe it's a coping mechanism. So people they're not afraid of death. They think that they have a chance after life to, still kind of interact and stuff like that. And just it's something that takes away the fear of death, in my opinion. So.
And do you think that rituals affiliated with death, such as a funeral or a wake, are essential to get into the afterlife? Or do you believe that no matter what, you just kind of go to the afterlife?
I think the rituals that happen after you die are more for the people in your life that continue to live. I don't think that you need to have a funeral or a week necessarily to go to wherever your afterlife is. I think it's more for the people that are alive.
Once you die, your soul leaves your body and you go up to heaven or you go down to hell. And so by the time we have the funeral here on earth, you're already where you're going to end up. So non-essential.
Funerals definitely help you get closure, and I think that's kind of what everyone looks for with funerals and afterlife is getting closure from losing a loved one.
Those were App State students expressing their understanding of religion in relation to death. And now, back to Religion and Life.
All right, so some very interesting perspectives there. Admittedly, this is an unscientific poll, but we've got students talking about the function of death rituals, the idea of an afterlife. They've been thinking about these things. Did anything there surprise you, or are these the sorts of attitudes that students bring to the class?
I didn't see anything surprising.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed very expected in terms of their ideas of the afterlife, and not just the ideas about the afterlife, but the functions of the ideas and the concepts and the practices. And I think that these ideas about the afterlife and about the function of the afterlife as a concept is prevalent in popular culture.
Right. And they're getting some of these ideas from their inherited religions, of course.
Right.
And so I'd like to talk about some of those religions. And you deal with some of these world global religions in your class.
Yeah.
Our hearers are going to be our listeners, our viewers are going to be predominantly Christian. So why don't we start with Christian ideas about death, ritual symbols, some of the predominant things you see going on in the Christian tradition that are relevant for confronting death.
When we look at Christianity in the class, we look at the historical development of the Christian soteriology, the message of salvation, the possibility of overcoming death itself, which is what makes Christianity radical for its time. And so the study of that history really is the study of how that soteriological, that message of salvation, becomes a historical reality for Christians. Meaning that we assume that that message alone has to be made socially, culturally, ritually, institutionally relevant as a reality. So therefore, kind of contrary to some of the things we just saw in the video, the afterlife is not a concept, actually. If we study the history of religion, we see that the afterlife is produced as a reality that exists right now. So heaven is a reality right now. It is not an afterlife.
I see.
So that history of that making of that reality is what I'm interested in. That's what we do in the class as well.
So you're suggesting, at least in part, that during the early years of Christianity, as it was developing, that the idea of surviving this life, the idea of there being a heaven and a hell are quite different, maybe didn't even exist in any way that we would recognize it, to what we would recognize in today's church or in today's Christian tradition.
I think, yes, I think that's generally the case for much of the research done by historians of Christianity from the early period up to medieval times has shown us that it took a very long time for the Christian afterlife to become an institutional, social, cultural reality. One function of this, for example, is the disposal of the dead and the special dead, the saints.
Right.
And so the history has shown us that one function of the dead was to bind the community of the living together. You know, so this new possibility of salvation introduces a ritual power in the world which allows the living to form a church, but also the church of the dead as well.
So the early community then is the church of the dead. They're bound together by these rituals that are surrounding the dead.
I think so. And in that sense, the dead help to make the afterlife a reality.
Okay.
To the extent where the dead, the tombs of the dead, were something that you ritually interacted with constantly, as mediated through the church, but also through your family. To that extent, the afterlife and death was not just a concept, but much more a reality, an everyday reality, if you will.
Is this more relevant to, say, medieval Christianity than it is today, do you think? Have we lost some of that contact with the dead? And in that sense, has our ideas of the afterlife weakened in the contemporary church, or is that not the case? Or what do you think there?
I'm not really a historian of Protestant Christianity, so I wouldn't say, but my gut feeling is that with the rise of Protestantism, the attitude and the construction of death does change, and it does, well, there's more of a emphasis on the individual.
Right.
So the kind of bond between the living and the dead diminishes. And so the kind of the construction of the afterlife as a reality gets kind of condensed and gets condensed as an individual private experience. So now we get more of an emphasis on the soul.
Right.
Right. The ascension of the soul, and less talk about the resurrection of the whole body.
Right.
The sacredness of the whole body that we find in Catholic theology, for example.
I want to come back to that, the comment you made there about the connection between the living and the dead. That might be a good segue to talk a little bit about filial piety and Confucianism. But I want to ask you one more question about Christianity before we leave. Hell.
Yes.
Is it more Dante or Bible?
In the class, we look at the history of the afterlife up to Dante. So, so because of that, I would say it's more Dante.
At least the way the contemporary community looks at hell. It's a place of punishment and kind of fiery afterlife.
I really think it depends on who you ask, because, well, in the Catholic community, it's still very much, I think, the hell of Dante.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
But in Protestantism, there are different interpretations, and it's something that's still, I think, debated.
Okay.
Very much so.
Okay, so you mentioned that one of the things that religion does here is to create a community of the living and the dead, and that becomes ritualized, and it helps bring people together.
Yep.
It sounds to me like that's very suggestive of what we see in Chinese religions with the famous Confucian filial piety. Could you talk a little bit about that, or am I on base here at all? Or,
No, that's exactly right, because filial piety is not just obedience and love towards one's living parents, but also a continuing responsibility to them after they die. And this is expressed through ritual, basically ritual offerings on an altar. So through this idea of filial piety, you can see it as another way of religion projecting some reality beyond this one, and that reality allows us to form a community of the living, for example, the family, but also the family is a passage of generations. And so filial piety, expressed through ancestor veneration, allows the living and the dead to form one coherent unity. That is the ideal, but of course, the ideal doesn't always work out.
And this ancestor veneration
Yeah.
is highly ritualized.
Yes.
And that way, I guess in some ways you're keeping a memory alive, but it's more than a memory. It's considered to be an actual presence, right?
Yes.
So is there in this system where there is veneration of ancestors, are ancestors present as ghosts, or is that an improper conception to bring into the idea of filial piety?
That's an interesting question. Technically, I think most people would say ancestors are definitely not ghosts.
Okay.
Because ghosts are unhappy spirits. So ancestors can become ghosts if you are not filial. If you renege on your ritual responsibility, so you don't want that to happen.
You don't want that to happen.
That's always a possibility.
Right.
But what it seems to me is, again, this is very similar to the Christian cases. What we have is this ritual system that allows the living and the dead to relate to each other through time.
Right.
And so the present is bound up to the past, but also bound up to the future as well. In terms of one duty of filial piety is to have children, to continue the family line.
Right.
So it allows individuals to think of the afterlife as one's own afterlife projected into the future through one's children, and therefore one's responsibility to the family and to society.
Because someday we will be in the place of the ancestors, and we need children to then keep us alive through veneration and through these rituals.
Right.
Yeah, and I guess I see in the Christian community, there's sort of weak examples of this. I mean, the idea of decorating tombstones and grave sites and visiting and maintaining grave sites might be at least an echo of this sort of sense that there's responsibility to maintain a connection with the dead beyond their lives.
I think so. So if you compare the two cases, you see the similarity, but I think also you see the difference in terms of, in the Confucian case, it's highly regulated and it's a compelled duty, right? It's not up to you.
Right.
And if you don't do it, then the tradition kind of gives you the idea to reflect back on yourself and think that's actually pretty shameful.
Right.
You're not being a good person.
Right.
Right. But as opposed to the other tradition where if you don't do it, it just means that you're busy and you have, you have a busy life, a career.
It's not a moral obligation.
Right. Right.
Well, let's move to your specialty, Buddhism. Very interesting ideas about karma. In the West, we call it reincarnation. I think that's probably a wrong term to use. But how does the system in Buddhism help one confront death?
So Buddhism arises and then uses the idea of karma, but reinterprets it. And so one reason that reincarnation is not actually used by some people, and rebirth is preferred, because technically speaking, it's not you being reborn. It's not your soul. It's just your kind of mental stream or mental habit that continues. And so the next existence is not you at all. So it's not a being being reincarnated.
Right.
So in that sense, it's different. And in this sense, also, what we find is similar to the Christian case is that the idea of reincarnation or karmic continuity means that when someone dies, they're not gone. Well, they're gone, but they still exist in some sense.
Right.
In some sense. So because you are still alive, you are still obligated to them in some sense. So we get the rise of rituals of karmic transfer, meaning that I create karmic merit, then I transfer the proceeds of that to the living. And so through the idea of karma, again, we see one way that religion allows the living to form a bond with the dead. And this is definitely a social bond, but also a kind of individual experience of one's connection to others.
Right.
Right.
So in karma, in this case, generally speaking, is kind of the accumulation of one's deeds in life that in part help determine what happens beyond life. Is that, am I misinterpreting that idea? And that it can extend to even affect the ones who are left behind, the living. Is that?
Yes, that's right. So there's individual karma, which we can think of as mental habituation. So karma essentially is mental habituation. One of the reinterpretations of karma that the Buddha taught was that once karma was identified as ritual action. So if you sacrifice to the gods, you got a lot of merit.
Right.
And so that gave you a good rebirth. But the Buddha kind of switched that over and then emphasized more mental intent, so that it wasn't so much what you sacrificed, but your mental intent that influenced, that determined your next existence. So karma is mental intent. But because we're individuals constantly kind of interacting with others, living in communities as social beings, our mental intent, our karmic stream is always somehow bound up with the karmic streams of others. Meaning that my mental habit right now influences your mental stream right now, whether or not you like it. Right. And over time, if we have a kind of friendship over time, or a parent and child relationship, our mental stream are so bound up together so that even if one dies, we're still bound up.
So karma is really relational.
It is, it is. It's individual and social.
And that relationship continues even after death.
Right.
So it seems to me that, and we could continue this across traditions, but one of the things, it seems to me the thing that binds at least the little bit we've talked about today together is that one of the things that religious rituals do concerning death is to either create or emphasize or allow people to continue relationships even beyond the portal of death.
Yes.
And that's where our funereal rituals come in.
Right.
In the case of Confucianism, the ancestor rituals and so forth. I think we're running out of time. Just a one quick word about near-death experiences. Do you talk about that? And is that something that students like to examine?
We look at that phenomenon at the end of the course when we talk about secular, non-religious approaches to death in American culture.
Okay.
Yep. It's very fascinating.
Is it a phenomenon that's limited to American culture, or is it more universal than that?
It's definitely universal, but the recent studies, the term itself, near-death experience, is a Western term. It's an English term. It's a recent phenomenon.
Right.
The historical reality might be really different.
So a recent phenomenon is in the past couple of decades?
Past 50 years or so.
Past 50 years, it's entered into our lexicon. And well, this has been fascinating, Kong. I want to take your class now. I know why students are coming to your class now. This is just incredibly interesting, and we thank you for offering this for our students here at ASU. We'll have you back again someday, maybe.
Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us on Religion and Life here at App TV. I'd like to thank my guest, Dr. Kong Mai, for stopping by this week. And on the next episode of Religion and Life, we'll be joined by Bill Butlin, who will lead us further into the exploration of the afterlife with his experiences of ghost hunting and haunting. We hope you will join us then. Until next time, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.